Story 1. My manager started snapping her fingers in my face, 3 inches away from my eyes, saying in a slow drawl, "You're doing it wrong. Hello? That's not how I told you to do it." When I was folding the shirt somewhat slower and less optimally than I was shown, though achieving the same fold. It was also my third week and one of 20 folds I had to learn on that job. I walked right then and there. Story 2. I worked for a call center for American Telephone and Telegraph. I refused to try and sell a direct television package to a woman who was literally bawling her eyes out on the phone because she was having to switch her phone plan to her name instead of her husband's name because he had just died. Story 3. My manager's boss did a surprise inspection, and my boss wrote me up for doing my job the exact way he trained me. Apparently, when he trained me, he was cutting corners. Story 4. I was a receptionist for a medical software company. My boss refused my request for a single day off to take my teenage daughter to get eye surgery. I waited until the first day of her 2-week vacation and put in my notice. Ruined her holiday. Story 5. The company told me I was to enforce 2 new policies. All employees must report to work 15 minutes early for their shift. However, they would not be paid for that time. All employees must take their unpaid lunch break in specific areas under very specific circumstances. I told them we needed to have a meeting to discuss the legality of their new policies before I could enforce them on my team. They replied, "Either you enforce the policies or you resign your position." I said, "See you." They begged me to reconsider and to not make a bad decision just because I was upset. Unfortunately, I was already out the door. Story 6. I was waiting tables while I was in graduate school. I had requested a weekend off far in advance, right after I got my syllabus, because there was a seminar pertinent to a class. Our professor expected us to go and write a paper. It was a decent chunk of our grade. The weekend comes up and, lo and behold, I'm scheduled doubles Friday through Sunday. I hunt down the manager and say I can't do that and I've given months' notice. She pulls the requests are just requests, not guarantees. And I tell her point blank I will fail this class if I don't go. She shrugged and said, "That isn't my problem." I told her, "It is now," and left. Like hell I was going to fail a class for my master's degree waiting tables at a rainforest cafe. Story 7. This was 20 years ago. My fiancée had been hospitalized for 16 months after a car accident. When she passed away, my boss would not let me have time off for bereavement because we were not legally married. Story 8. I was working when I got the call that my partner of 7 years had been in a terrible car accident while visiting family in Florida. He was in the hospital, and his mother called me to tell me he wasn't awake yet. I was obviously devastated and scared out of my mind. I told my coworkers and boss because it was obvious I was panicking, and they told me to take the rest of the weekend off so I could deal with things and prepare and clean his apartment for when or if he got back. Specifically, they said to come back Monday, and it was a Friday. The next day, I was cleaning up his apartment when I got the call from my boss screaming about why I hadn't come into work that day. I told him that I recalled him telling me to take the weekend off and come back Monday. He said to come to work immediately because they needed me. Against my better judgment and my emotional state, I showed up and clocked in. The boss came up to me, threw the stack of checks down on the counter that had just come in, and told me, "If you do that again, you're fired." This was someone who had never yelled at me before or even dared speak to me in any stern way. Prior to my arrival, their store was an absolute mess, and I spent all of my free time, what little there was, reorganizing and cleaning and setting up new systems. For some reason, the fact he chose to start speaking to me this way and demanding my attention at that time just made me snap. A chord was struck, and it resonated strongly. I got the message clearly. He was one of those bosses who became controlling of anyone who became of value to him and his business. The moment you weren't available when they needed or even wanted you to be, they were going to make you feel bad about it, so you were afraid to ask for more personal time or any other leniencies that took you away from work. I was literally reeling. I saw red. The moment he turned his back, I snatched my check, walked out with a full line of customers at the counter, and the phone going off with incoming orders, and drove off. He blew up my phone all day. I never came back or called back. Fortunately, he made it home safe and healed up fine. Unfortunately, he passed away on our anniversary a few years later. I regret every moment I passed up to spend time with him over that job or any job, for that matter. I know barely anyone is going to read this now that it's buried under a pile of other comments. But it still felt nice to type it out. Edit. I've probably said kind words over a dozen times, but I really do mean it. Reddit can be just as comforting as it can be cruel. So it means a lot that you've all carved out a few seconds from your day to recognize me and my story and to say some things. His name was Anthony, and I want everyone to know what an amazing, brilliant, kind, gentle man he was. Strong, dark, and stern, yet he was the light of my life. Please, please, please take the extra moment to ask your loved ones if they're okay. Story 9. Many years ago, while working in a manufacturing facility, my boss came into work already upset because his wife served him divorce papers. Saying good morning was apparently enough to set him off, and he picked up a wrench from the table and threw it at my head. I ducked, it missed, then I just closed my toolbox and wheeled it to the truck. Story 10. One very busy night while waitressing, I was standing at a table of 12 in the middle of taking their order when another waitress came up to me and said our boss wanted us in their office that instant. So I leave my full section in the middle of chaos to go see what the problem is. My boss began to criticize us both because the other girl asked if I would switch shifts with her and I had agreed. I didn't say anything but was obviously annoyed because I had just left all my tables thinking there was some sort of emergency. My boss looked at me and asked why I looked mad, and I told him, I feel like this could have been sorted out without me. If you didn't want her to leave early, you could have just told her no instead of pulling me away from our customers. They said, if you're going to have an attitude, get your things and leave. I said okay and went to transfer my tables. I was over it. I had worked there 3 years, and the owners were alcoholics that treated us like garbage and spent all the company money on themselves instead of getting ingredients to make food or paying their employees. The other waitress came back out and said our boss wanted me back in the office. I went in and they said, put your apron back on. You're not fired. I said, you're both crazy if you think you can treat people the way you do and expect them to want to work for you. And I walked out. As I was leaving, they came out behind me saying I would regret it and was never allowed back if I left. I threw up my middle fingers and kept walking. Funny part is I let my boyfriend take my car to work that night, so I had to walk a mile home and break into my house. Story 11. Was having a meeting with the boss who was a difficult guy to work with, and he stood up and punched the wall. He wasn't doing it jokingly. He bare-knuckled went at the wall of his own office like he was in the gym hitting a punching bag. I sat there in astonishment for about 2 seconds, then stood up and left, cleared out my desk and exited through the back door without a word to anyone. There's no place for that conduct in the professional world, even if the guy does own the company. Story 12. He would not train me properly, then come yell at me in front of the office. He would always threaten my job or suggest hiring someone else, and I finally said I hope you find someone better because I quit and will be leaving once the other lady comes back from lunch. He tried to backpedal and asked if I was serious. I never looked back. Edited to add. He hired me without any experience because he knew he could offer me a low salary. I got paid very little for what someone with experience would get paid. Story 13. At one office job, I quit after the first day because the lady training me would ignore me when our manager was not around, and I caught her snooping through my purse when I went to the bathroom. At another job at a clinic, I quit after a month because they made me do a solo receptionist shift without training me on what I needed to do to open the clinic, and then I got yelled at for not knowing what to do in front of patients. It was so bad. Some of the patients came up to me after and asked if I was okay. Story 14. I was vomiting in the parking lot every day before walking into my job from stress. Then one day I was kicked in the teeth, literally, by one of the clients, and my boss would not let me leave to go to the dentist. I went anyway, was docked pay for my time at the emergency appointment, and then they begged me not to sue. Quit. Story 15. I was exhausted, had been working 50-plus-hour weeks, and couldn't wait until Christmas break. I was the only person out of 25 required to work Saturday mornings on a 6-week fundraiser in addition to my regular hours. Others were only scheduled once. I was scheduled all 6 Saturdays. Finally, a foreign colleague wanted to work Christmas so she could go to her home country early in the next year. The entire office was supposed to be closed for those 2 weeks. The boss picked me to be with her and refused to let me say no. I didn't want to take a break later when the rest of my family would have been off over Christmas. And I couldn't bear to have waited another 2 weeks as I was barely hanging on right then. She wouldn't let it go, so I quit. The boss decided to work with her herself. That was fine with me. The mystery is why it had to be me or her out of 25 coworkers. Well, not my problem. Story 16. I never have, but my favorite example was when a coworker in student transportation, who had finally gotten a position she wanted after years of suffering through stress in another, was called by management over the summer and told she was being reassigned to the stressful position because no one else wanted to do it. She had fought too long and hard to get what she wanted, and her immediate response was, "Then tell me what I need to do to resign." She did, and she's been at peace with her decision ever since. Story 17. Godfather's Pizza. The manager would not give me my paycheck at 8 p.m. on Sunday because the money might not be in the account yet, but I could pick it up at 9 a.m. on Monday. This was decades ago, before direct and mobile deposits. The bank would not be open until the next day anyway. All of the paychecks were literally in his hand at that moment. There were lots of issues before that, but that was the final sign that the manager was completely uninterested in reason. In the next few weeks, nearly everyone else quit. Then the manager was finally fired. Story 18. Not me, but a colleague once wrote a long, critical email, hit send at 10:30 a.m., and exited the building immediately. He blind copied all recipients but sent it to multiple departments of a large multinational company I was working at. No one knew who did or didn't receive the email, except for the gasps and reactions around the office. He was completely disgruntled and criticized multiple managers, supervisors, and various colleagues with absolute intensity. It was amazing, still the best work email I've ever received, and some issues he highlighted actually had to be addressed by management. It brought about a lot of positive change. If you're out there, Khalil, that was awesome. Story 19. When I was 20, I worked a commission-based sales job. The manager hated me for some reason. I genuinely, to this day, have no idea why. I tried really hard, had a good attitude, and followed all the rules. My sales weren't extraordinary, but I always met my numbers. My grandmother died about 6 months into the job. I texted my manager to tell him I'd be taking my 3 days of bereavement as allowed by the union. I even apologized for the inconvenience, as though I could control my grandmother's death. He called me the day after she died, accusing me of lying, saying I was lazy and just wanted the time off. Keep in mind, I'd never called out before or even been more than 5 minutes late to a shift. I sent him medical documentation proving she'd had a stroke during the night and passed away. He called me back and said fine, I could have that day off, but he better see me the next day, my 3rd day of union-protected bereavement, or I'd be fired. Stricken with grief but terrified of losing my job, I drove the 2 hours back to my apartment from my grandmother's house that night. The next morning, I went into work tired and melancholy. He told me to smile because no one wants to buy cell phones from a sad girl. I plastered on a smile and hit the sales floor. At lunchtime, I cried my eyes out in my car, reapplied my makeup, and went back to work with my fake smile. I was in the middle of helping a customer when he came over and started asking the customer all the same questions I had to see what products they'd be eligible for. The customer was baffled and told him I'd already covered everything and that no further help was necessary. He went on a rant about what a terrible, useless employee I was. I looked at the customer and said, "I'm so sorry to leave you with him, but as of this moment, I quit." The manager followed me to the break room, shouting and raving while I gathered my purse, turned in my equipment, and clocked out. He followed me to my car, still berating me. Finally, that same customer I walked away from came out and physically stood between me and the manager so I could get in my car and drive away. The manager proceeded to call me every day for a week and leave abusive voicemails about me missing shifts because he didn't accept my resignation. He even called me the day of my grandmother's funeral and said now that she'd been cremated, I had no excuse not to come back to work. I hope he eventually got a taste of his own medicine. Story 20. I was a supervisor of housekeeping at a hotel. Every holiday, all of management would take off, leaving me the highest in charge. I asked for a raise after working a full year of holidays as the only management and was denied. The next year, on the biggest party day in the city, I set all my employees up with their work and texted the managers a picture of me at the bar partying, telling them the hotel might be on fire. I don't know. Quit.